Okay, so now that you have your files all organized and ready to go, you've got them imported into your software, now we're going to create a timeline. So when we go into the software here, and you're going to go up to File, New, Sequence, and in Premiere Pro, at least, you can also click on this little paper icon down here at the bottom. That'll bring up the same thing inside your project window. And when you get in here, you're going to see that there's a lot of options. At least in Premiere, it pulls up all these presets and everything. In Final Cut, I know this is a lot simpler. In Resolve, it is a little bit more complicated. So don't get too overwhelmed with all of these options. You don't need to worry about most of them. In fact, there's only 4 things that you really need to worry about unless you're a really advanced power user. So in Premiere, we're going to come over here to this Settings tab. And over here, the 4 different things that we're going to worry about on this tab are these: our frame rate, resolution, aspect ratio, and audio. Okay, so our frame rate is going to be the project frame rate that we're using for this project. So if you shot all your footage in 24 frames per second, then you're going to select 24 or 23.976 frames per second. If you shot in 30 frames per second, let's say you're doing something for broadcast or for sports or whatever, those are typically shot at 30 frames per second, then you can do that. And then some people shoot some 60 frames per second footage. I know gamers use that for recording. Some people will do it for YouTube stuff. They're shooting stock footage or anything like that. So those are kind of special scenarios, but 9 times out of 10 for you guys, you're probably going to be choosing 23.976 or 24 frames per second. So that's your frame rate for the project. Now, if you shot high frame rate footage that you intend to slow down as slow motion in your project, then you still want to select 24, and then you'll take that high frame rate footage and we'll conform it back when we get to that point. Okay? Next up is resolution. So in here, you can see that we have our resolution, our frame size, horizontal and vertical. If you shot in HD or 1080p, that's going to be 1920 by 1080. If you shot in 4K, that'll be 3840 by 2160. So you're just going to choose the resolution of the footage that you shot. So when it comes to resolution, I always have people asking me what resolution should I use, because a lot of times filmmakers will shoot different footage at different resolutions. So for example, if you have a camera that shoots primarily in 4K, but only shoots 24 frames per second in 4K, and you shot some high frame rate or slow motion footage in 60 frames per second, and that it will only shoot in 1080p, then you end up with 2 different resolutions. And the general rule of thumb here is to always choose the lowest resolution. So if you have footage that's in 1080p and some that's in 4K, then you should use the 1080p resolution, because then you're down-resing your 4K footage to 1080p rather than up-resing your 1080p footage to 4K, which is not going to look as good. The exception to this rule is really if you're shooting a project that is primarily in 4K, and let's say you shot 100 clips and 99 of them are in 4K, and there's just one thing that you had to shoot for some reason in 1080, then in that case, I would probably take the 1080 clip and just up-res it and just not worry about it for that one clip. Now, the other thing to think about when you're choosing resolution is what resolution you're going to export the video at. So if your final export is going to be 1080p, then it doesn't matter if you create the timeline at 4K, it's not going to make a big difference. So if you're exporting for 1080 or if you're exporting to 4K, probably choose that resolution when you set up your project. Next up is aspect ratio, which in Premiere you don't have to worry about it. It just determines it for you based on the resolution that you choose. But if you're shooting 1080p or 4K, normally that's going to be 16:9, unless you're shooting on a high-end cinema camera that allows you to change that resolution, then that might be a little bit different. If not, then you don't need to worry about that. And then lastly, we'll jump down here to the audio section. For video, you want to make sure your sample rate is set at 48,000 hertz, and that's all you need to worry about there. Now, like I said, there are other options here where you can get a little bit more advanced with things, but basically the rule of thumb is if you don't know what these things mean, then just leave them at default and you'll be just fine. Now, there's one more way to create a sequence that I want to talk about here, and this exists in Premiere Pro. I don't think there's a way to do it like this in Final Cut or Resolve. If there is, you can correct me if I'm wrong. But basically what you can do is, rather than opening up that window and going through and setting all the settings, you can actually take one of your clips that you shot and create a sequence based off of it. So for example, I've already got some clips here that are shot at 23.976 frames per second and that are in 4K 4096 by 2048. And that's exactly how I want the timeline to be, because this is my main resolution. So what I can do is I can grab this clip and just drag it down to the new icon right here. And when I release, you'll notice that it's going to create a brand new timeline and put that clip on the timeline and that this timeline is now created with those exact same specs. So for example, I'll show you, if we open it up here and we look at the timeline, you'll notice that it is 23.976 and the resolution is 4096 by 2048. That way, you don't have to worry about all the settings. You can just choose a clip that represents the resolution and the frame rate and everything that you want. And then once the sequence is created, then you just go ahead and delete that clip, and then you can start editing from there. There you go. There's how you create your timeline with correct settings. It is important to get these things right, because if you don't, you might end up with dropped frames or other issues happening when you try to export your videos. So you want to make sure that your resolution, your frame rate, your audio, your aspect ratio, all of that remains consistent throughout the entire process, from shooting to editing to export, so that you get the best quality video in the end.